And on the first day, God said to his chorus of angels, I will make a new kingdom more beautiful than the face of heaven, made only of dust. Welcome to another episode of the Interstice podcast. Thank you so much, first of all, to the patrons who support me. That's how content like this gets made. If you don't already, please do consider supporting me there for as little as $1 a month. So, what's that thing I'm talking about at the beginning there? It was basically, it's death. I was thinking death would be a fun, light topic that we could go on about, but in what context do we discuss this? So there was a few that I thought would be really, really interesting. I thought we'd start actually with a show that I watched not too long ago, which is incredible. It is called Midnight Mass, and I don't want to spoil too much about it, but it's basically to have a discussion of, it's 7 episodes, no mistake there. It's a discussion of like one of the greatest like monster movies ever made. If you haven't seen it, I couldn't recommend it more to you. Some people say that it's a little bit slow, but it's not. And there's great consideration of like, what does your life mean? What does dying mean? Should this be something that we avoid? If not, then what is the value in it? And I had all these like really, really cool thoughts about death recently. You start to do that a little bit more when you get a little bit older. I think it's kind of unavoidable, where when you are young, of course, you're eternal and there's no way that you could one day die. This is going to get a little bit, I don't know, heavy and philosophical. So if that's not your jam, I completely understand. Now is your fair warning. Spoilers ahead. It's going to go into that sort of thing. But I wanted to discuss some of the ideas that I had that related to this, and I thought they were pretty cool. I don't know if I can, I wrote about this on my website. I'll do my best to articulate it now, and we'll discuss a whole variety of things here, but this is one I thought I would, let's get this idea out that I had, which was really, really cool, and some of the epiphanies that I had for considering what a life after death, or kind of our place in death and the whole of creation, you know, really light stuff, things that you chat about over Thanksgiving dinner, things like that. So I'd start it with that I thought about dreams. Oh, we can't have this here. This is for anybody who is watching. It'll look way cooler if we don't have my Steam account up there. The DT logo in the background on the computer screen, that's way cooler. So this kind of thought came to me when I was considering dreams and taking ourselves as kind of a mini universe and relating to what happens when you dream as being kind of equivalent to perhaps what happens when you die as it relates to the greater structure that surrounds it. And the example I would give of this is, I'm always very fond of this kind of like gotcha point that I say to people. And it's not a gotcha point, but it's sort of. It's that one thing that people often don't consider is the perspective from which they dream and how much of a dream is them. And so what I mean to say when I talk about that is that when you're dreaming, you are usually doing it from the perspective of a personal point of view. So just as I'm talking from my personal point of view in the waking life right now, when you dream, you are the main character. You're experiencing things from the perspective of an individual within a dream, but what that fails to capture is that whoever you meet, whoever you talk to, whatever you see, all of the landscape, all of the people, all of those are just as much you as the personal perspective that you're perceiving it from. So that is that when you look at the hills, you're making the hills. When you talk to the people and they talk back to you, those people are just as much you as the self perspective that's speaking to them, because you are entirely responsible for the entire dream. A dream is not something that you go and participate in that's separate of yourself. You're the whole thing. And so I had this thought as it relates to the whole of the universe and our place within it, where you could think of it this way, that if the greater dream that you're in is the universe, and the self that you perceive it from is a part of that universe, they're not separate from each other. It's kind of an illusion of separation, because you're so used to experiencing things in the first person perspective that the rest of the dream doesn't feel like it is you, but we know it could be nothing other than you because it's your brain creating all of that. So how does that relate to death in the universe? Well, if you thought about it this way, that you in your waking life, as you go about your daily life, that's you moving through the dream. But then the greater universe is sort of the greater consciousness that you were just as equally attached to, like you were attached to your brain creating the rest of the dream, that is how we go through existence. This will be a little bit circumlocucious as I try and articulate the idea, but it's like waking, all of life is a dream, as I'm very fond of. It's in fact the banner on my website, or not my website, my channel that I have. When you go through your daily life, you are, from the first perspective, having a dream. And everything that's around you seems separate of you. It's the hills, it's the mountains, it's your friends, it's everybody that you're speaking to. But in actuality, we know that what I'm made of is no different from whatever any other substance is created from. It's all atoms, it's all the same substrate, it's all the same medium that composes what happens. And so, say if I can get this out with brevity, when you live your life, that is you experiencing the dream from the first person perspective. But then when you die, you are dissolved back into the substrate, which is the universe, which is the greater united reality. So it's like when you die, this is kind of a tired way to put it, but it's like you're returning to the source. You're returning to the greater whole. And so when you die, you become more aware of the fact that you were always a part of this greater thing, just like we can make this observation about our dreams that, oh, those people that I talked to in the dream, they are me. Those hills that I saw, they are me. Now, it seems a lot more concrete when you're out here in the real life. To get rid of the illusion of separateness within a dream is easy, because when you wake up, you know that it was entirely created from your brain. It's harder when you're going through your day-to-day life to see that connection that you have to the universe, because we are way more acutely aware of our ego and ourselves when you're in your physical body as opposed to experiencing a dream. But I would like to suggest that it is no different. It's all a dream, and when you die, you return to the greater substrate and you become basically whole with the entirety of it. I thought that's a really, really interesting concept to go with. It really illustrates the same kind of unity that you creating the dream and experiencing a dream when you go to sleep could be compared to you experiencing the dream of life, and then when you die, you return to that greater whole. Now, I don't know if I've done an even halfway decent job of explaining kind of the concept that I think about there. I hope I have, or at least I hope that I've given you at least some frame of reference to maybe go into thinking about it a little bit more clearly yourself, to consider waking life and death as the waking life is the dreamer, and then your death is, well, it's the greater whole. There we go. I've had a coffee today, so if I'm shaking a little bit, it's not Parkinson's. Some people say that about me. They're like, you have Parkinson's disease, because they see that I have a shake in my head, but that's just it's just a tremor, and when I drink coffee, it becomes incredibly worse. But by the power of coffee, I was able to like really, really feel this idea. I wrote it down in a journal entry on my website, but I don't think I've ever talked about it before here on the podcast. And I think there's a lot of peace that can be given with that, because I think what we feel is there is just this end, that you die, and in some sense you exit reality at that point. And people find peace in it for the fact that they can think to themselves, well, I don't really care because I won't really be thinking about it. I was like, okay, that's one way to think about it, but wouldn't it be more comforting to feel like it's a kind of return? It's kind of like, well, here's another way to put it, is that we often think that our waking lives are, what would you say, they're the way things should be. But if you think about it, in the existence of the universe, the whole thing, this billions and billions of years, actually our lives that we experience are the exception, they're not the rule. The status quo is actually just matter existing. It's just that you were not here, which is more the normal thing. It is this incredible, I don't know what the likelihood of somebody's birth is, but it's like we know that this is really, really, really rare that you get to experience this. And so you're more like returning to business as usual as opposed to disrupting the way that things should be. And then it feels more natural. I feel like a lot of fear, like some of my own fears about death are that you're doing something unnatural. This is the natural state. This is the way I should be. I get to experience things. I get to drink coffee. I get to eat donuts and order way too much food from Uber Eats. This is the way things should be. But actually, you're returning more to how things naturally are. And I like that. If I could go away from this idea, just like I keep kind of returning to try and make the point, it's that there is a whole, like, think of it this way, is the universe is like the whole mega brain. And you experiencing your life are like that brain having a dream. But then when you finally die, you just dissipate into the greater brain. It raises a lot of interesting questions because about consciousness and about experience, because I wonder, as far as we understand it, and I put this in some short recently, we don't understand consciousness. There's all sorts of really, really fascinating ideas that go into it, but it's unprovable. It really is something that's subjective, and that relates a lot to what I was talking about in the previous podcasts about AI and whether it matters that we can quantify exactly what consciousness is. It just matters that we believe that something is conscious. So I wonder, what is consciousness like when you no longer exist, when you were a part of the universe, all matter? I don't think it would be a personal one, obviously, because the personal one necessarily feels, in some sense, isolated. You feel like yourself. So I wonder, like, what is the universe's perception? I warned you it was going to get really metaphysical here and weird, so don't blame me for things going off the rails at this point. And I wonder what that could be like. I guess what I'm talking about then is, what are the different forms of experiencing consciousness? You know, we can see, maybe another way that I could illustrate this point is insofar as we can see it at least in the animal kingdom or in life. So we wouldn't say that grass is conscious, obviously, or any plants are, but then we see a lot of behaviors that, if you just did a checklist of a human needs energy to grow. Oh, well, plants need energy to grow. Humans have a life cycle. They grow and then they die. Oh, well, plants do that. Now, that I'm trying to illustrate is saying that there's like different levels of consciousness and experience, so that just because you don't have the I think, therefore I am consciousness, doesn't mean that there couldn't be other types of consciousness. For example, I mean, it's incredible. There was a period of time that humans thought of animals as basically being automatons. Like we didn't think at some point in history that animals actually felt pain. It was sort of an autonomic illusion that they were like that. But as we've gone on to understand animals better and better and better, we know that, oh no, they definitely feel pain as science progresses. And then we know as well that they have all sorts of interesting characteristics that in a much higher state of consciousness parallel our own. That when what would be a good example of that? I often refer to Reddit because I'm scrolling through there all the time, but one of my favorite subreddits is the one that's called Like Us. And it's all these different examples of animals that are behaving like us. And it's a great illustration of, like, they're not so different from us. I think of the Moby song or album or whatever it was called. It's called Earthlings. Then kind of like, as opposed to us separate from animals, like all together is one, just at kind of like different levels of consciousness. So we have animal consciousness, and that is another form, obviously not quite our own. At some level, like an ant, for example, is a superorganism. They're very collectivist. But then if you go up, like, say you get really, really close to us, say you go into primates, or for example, say you had dolphins, you see all sorts of incredible behaviors there that are one step removed from us. I mean, I think there is some sort of argument that, like, some animals could be more intelligent than us, but because they lack the opposable thumbs or ability to create tools, they sort of stayed at that level of consciousness. There's something else that emerges when you're able to craft tools and then more directly impact your environment. But it doesn't even exclude you from speech. There's all sorts of great sciences to do with whale song and how they're communicating with each other. A great example would be play. because I can't think of, maybe somebody could correct me if they watch this and they're really, really into this stuff, but as I understand it, play serves no evolutionary function. It's really high level consciousness that participates in play. And we see other animals that do this, like all the time, whether it's from primates. One of the great examples I enjoy where it seems very, very unlikely, but they totally know that they do it is, what is it, cephalopods? Octopuses. Octopuses enjoy play, and they have all these various examples of how octopus participate in play. And so that's something that they are so high up on the level of consciousness that they're participating in things that now no longer involve survival or an evolutionary necessity. They're just so evolved, so high thinking, whatever you want to describe that as, that they're doing things that we would do, which we would usually state as one of our defining characteristics of being totally self-aware and totally sentient. Really, really, really interesting stuff when you consider death and consciousness and different levels of that, which I find really, really intriguing. It would be, well, I don't know what it would be, but it's, I like to think about, or I'm comforted by the thought of, you would become a different type of consciousness, but it's the sort of one where, does it even matter that I care about it? Because when you experience that kind of consciousness, it wouldn't have the same concerns. That's the best way to put it, is that when you become one with the universe again, when you become dust, as I prefaced this whole thing with, what is dust experiencing itself? What is the whole universe experiencing itself? People have that idea that you hear very often, that sentience and life is created for a way for the universe to experience itself. But I think that that's actually somewhat of a limited perspective, because I think that the universe could experience itself in an even greater way, but just not in the way that we typically think of things, because we only think of consciousness from the perspective of a self, as opposed to, maybe this is a great way to put it, a distributed self. The universe is the finest example of a distributed self. But when you do that, you're thinking in a very, very different way. That would go without saying. And I'll cap all of this off that if you are looking for something that's absolutely awesome on Netflix and you're stuck for a good show to watch, that you have got to check out Midnight Mass, because it is absolutely incredible. And there is a line basically within that talks about, well, it's another like biblical line about you are from dust and dust you shall return. That concept, and that in Catholicism, I believe it has Ash Day of the week. I don't know if it's Ash Wednesday or something like that, which signifies some part of the life cycle in that old guy, Jesus Christ, and acknowledges this kind of cyclical nature, that you only exist to basically die. There was like another great example of this. I was listening to Alan Watts a little bit today, so that of course kind of like sparks this conversation, but he has this like really, really funny line that life is a disease, or life is a condition with an immediate problem at its start and then like a horrible prognosis for its conclusion. I was like, yeah, that's true. We are born to die. What is that? She does the song Blue Jeans. Lana Del Rey, we were born to die, that kind of concept. A little bit bittersweet, isn't it? You get other great ideas within that as well. I think about, for example, one of the lines from that movie, which I enjoyed, but I didn't even enjoy too much at the time that it came out, but there were certain parts of it which were great, which was Troy. And you had a buff stud, what is it, Brad Pitt, and he says at one point he's talking to someone about mortality, and he's talking about how the gods envy mortals, because by virtue of the fact that we do die, our lives mean something to us. Whereas if you were immortal and you went on forever, then you've completely diluted experience by making it a non-scarce resource. Scarcity is a really complex topic, but I mean, we know without question that scarcity creates value, and in fact, like, that's kind of the paradigm that we live in now. We live in a society which is run by, we live in a scarcity society, and there's all sorts of really conversations about like what a post-scarcity society would be like. I don't want to add the conclusion that I think it's an interesting idea to discuss that in, Achilles says that in the movie, that he says that we are envied because of our finite existence. And it is making the assumption that to be finite adds that value, where I think you could have an interesting back and forth then to discuss, well, actually, maybe it wouldn't be so bad to have unlimited experience, and I don't feel that that's diluted at all. For example, the fact that I don't want to die, where I find some peace with it. I try and roll this idea over in my head all the time, finding comfort with it, but I would like a little bit more real estate when it came to the number of hours and minutes and seconds that I have to go on with. I suppose maybe the caveat that I could put into that would be that fine, certainly to end at some point, but I feel that we have far too much scarcity right now, that you could live for however many years, and then for the last part of your life, well, what is your quality of life when you're 90 years old? You're still alive, but could it not be better? And a lot of people, from the perspective of saying that they don't mind to die, is from the fact that because of at the end of life can become so miserable that death seems a better option than were you to go on living. But when you look at it through the lens of a child, for example, again, returning to that point, that going on forever in that state is, it seems pretty appealing at the time. You're like, I don't want to go anywhere. I mean, this is awesome. I run through the fields, I climb the trees, I build forts. But that is also because I think that there is the naive, however you put it, for someone who lacks experience, where there is an interesting correspondence, I think, between experience and then having had enough. There is some English. Having had enough. That we are more and more at peace, because it seems to be, with a lot of people anyways, I don't think many of them are faking it, that when they have lived enough, they've had enough great experiences, and they come to a point in their lives where they're quite content to die because they feel like they've had a full, rich life. And like I was making this point earlier about relative scale of how long you've been living, it doesn't even seem to take that long a time. That you could have lived for 70 or 80 years, and by the end of that, if you had a rich life with great relationships and meaningful action, that's enough. So we don't know yet what the sort of opinions of people would be like if they'd lived for 200 years. If you found that actually after 150 years of experience, people are like, oh, that's, push away from the table, leave before you're entirely full, that's the healthy thing to do, that you would be content. But we don't really know until we get to try that out, do we? Because I think, for me, so long as I could go on having novel and interesting experiences and trying to do different things that I'd never done before, that I would want to go on living. I would want to continue to go on to have those experiences, but I don't know where the end line of that is. When is somebody full enough of rich experience that they no longer want to experience more? Perhaps the answer to that is that it is indefinite for each person. Maybe there are people who are like, oh no, I want a good solid century, and then I'm ready to tap out. And then perhaps there are people like me, at least in the immediate moment when I reflect on it, that would want to go on for much longer. That's the thing when people say, do you want to live forever? I'm like, I don't know that I want to live forever, but I know that I want to live longer than I can now. And there's so many behaviors that I participate in that are for that reason. I mean, obviously I'm working out and trying to eat healthy and do the things that make me live longer for the purpose of, in the immediate moment, that they keep me happy, they keep me engaged. They make the time that you spend here better. But it's also because this ensures, or at least somewhat ensures, that you're going to go on for much longer, so that in that healthy state of mind that you can have more of that. It's an interesting idea, definitely. I like to explore it. So there's 23 minutes on life, death, and dust, and that we all return to it for the time being. That's I always get into these discussions of longevity on the podcast with my friends, and I read all sorts of books for it as well. There's a couple that I could recommend. I don't want to too heavily go into... Actually, I'm going to do a bit of book stuff today. That's okay. We just got to roll with it. But there's a book by David Sinclair called Why We Age, Why We Don't Have to, The New Science on Longevity. It's great, really, really interesting. There's another book that I've read called The Telomere Effect. That's really, really interesting, to do with our telomeres, which are basically the cells. It's the part of the cell that is responsible for creating new cells, and how if these stayed in really, really good shape, you can go on creating healthy new cells. But as we age and through different destructive behaviors, that we shorten them. And that's one of the reasons that you see somebody increase or accelerate the rate at which they're aging, whereas other people who have taken on healthy behaviors keep these long. And so that somebody who could be 40 years old and this person is 40 years old, temporally they're the same age, but actually biologically they're not. I can't remember the exact term for describing biological age over temporal age, but there's a lot of things that go into exactly how old we are in actuality, in terms of a biological sense, as opposed to just the time. And they're great books. They're intriguing. Trying to cut myself one more slice of life, so to speak. And I don't know. There's so many great relationships that you have, that you think about losing them and you don't want to. I think about that a lot, actually. It's I can only imagine that's one of the things that I think most affects people as they get old as well, which people don't consider, is you often think of aging as it relates to yourself personally, but I have observed, and I think others do, but I never hear people talk about this, is that as we age, your world ages with you. And what I mean to say there is that all of the people, for example, that I grew up with when I was a kid, and they were these like young, amazing stars, because I've said this, ad nauseum, that I love film and I love stories, and all those people, as you get older, they get older too. And so all of those people that made you feel young, you can look at yourself and try and think that, like, oh, I'm still in really, really good shape, and I'm working out and I'm eating well, and I got good cardiovascular health, and I go to the sauna all the time to reduce all-cause mortality. But you cannot help but look outside of yourself and see how that world that made you feel young is also getting old. It's a strange feeling. And I think about how difficult that must be, where it's not just these people. I was using the example of media and the things that you consume that are now aging, but the difficulty, the real struggle with watching your friends get old as well. That would probably, maybe I could have started with that example. That would have been better. But that thing that people don't talk about as much again as well is, as you get old, when you started to lose friends to age. Not trying to make this a downer podcast. It's all beautiful. It's all, life is a beautiful thing. Truth is beautiful. But it doesn't discount or remove from the fact that a lot of life is very, very sad, a sort of beautiful sad. And I think about that too a lot. I wonder, I really do wonder what it could be, because I love to read books that consider a future where, now in fiction, not talking about nonfiction, but considering socially what we would be like if we were able to live for several centuries. There's a series of books, Peter F. Hamilton, I talk about him all the time, and I will continue to do so. He's got a couple of different universes that he's built. He's the foremost sci-fi author in the UK, and there's all these different ways in the different universes that he has where people have been able to conquer death. Let's just use that very, very dramatic description of it. And all the different ways that society has adapted for that. So in one of his series, the way that is dealt with, the way that people go on living, is that it's rejuvenation. So it's not that people do not grow old, it's that you grow old and then you rejuvenate. And then whenever you rejuvenate, they actually, I can't remember the name for it, but they have these basically resorts that are tuned to the fact that all the people who would go there are recently rejuvenated, to the account for the fact that they're all now just brimming with hormones again and horny as fuck. and everybody just wants to go around sleeping with each other, and they know that, like, oh, as soon as you get a rejuvenated 200-year-old who's gone back to the physical body of a 24-year-old, they're going to want to get out there and copulate. They're going to want to fornicate. Let's see how many words I have for this. And I liked that idea. And then there's just cool little like odd throw-ins that go with it as well, where there is a woman and she's on some space crew and they're talking about what they need to do to accomplish something, and they're sending in, you know, this group and that group, and she was like, you know, thank God we actually have some people with experience here and people who are at least into their mid 200s. You know, we don't want any of those like, you know, mid 100-year-olds, like just babies, you know, screwing this up for all their lack of emotional maturity. And I was like, oh, that's funny. And then another example was, when we think now, this is the parallel where it's shifted forward a little bit, is that if you consider relationships now and how we socially judge people who are not in like age or who are far from each other in age by, I don't know, people would probably accept something like 5, but as soon as you start to go over 5 years, people are like, oh, well, that's a bit spicy, isn't it? And the same thing is true in this world, where if you are, say, 200 years old or 300 years old, and then you have a relationship with somebody who's like just barely over 100, that's considered robbing the cradle. And that of course is a great source of humor for me. I was like, ha, like thinking of a 100-year-old, although maybe they're in a 24-year-old's body, whatever it might be, as being, you know, precocious, something like that is very, very, very entertaining to me. I love the idea of having controlled our physical body. Like, okay, so this is something that I could like slap this down in a second, and to me it shows like incredible short-sightedness. When I saw it on, I think it was a YouTube short recently, and it was one of these, again, it was these gotcha moments where this guy is asked about, well, what do you think, you know, what do you think gender like means? Like, are there 2 genders, or like, you know, defining again, because there's all this conversation right now about what defines you as your gender, and, you know, is it just like the youth having their way and having their cake and eating it too, to create all these subgenders and subsexualities? And then this sort of like what is taken to be pragmatic thinking, this guy says, well, I can tell you one thing, that we may have this discussion now about whatever you think gender may be and may not be, but if 100 years from now, when they dig up that body, you're either going to have a penis or you're not. And so I think that pretty much speaks for itself. There's only 2 genders. I was like, oh, sweet summer child, that you think that human biology, if we don't blow everything up, within 100 years is going to be limited to that? You got to read more, man. You got to open your eyes. We are already, I lost this word. It's not imposing, intervening. We have already intervened so much in the physical state of ourselves. And we can look at this very practically. Like, look at asthmatics, look at diabetics, look at how much we've already altered our physiology, and also the inclusiveness in our society of people who could just never have existed before. That's not gender necessarily, but I'm highlighting that as a point of how we have intervened. Now, that's only going to continue. When you get complete mastery of your biology, gene editing, whatever you want to call it, then you're going to be able to do whatever you want, and it's not going to be so plain and simple as that it has a penis or it has a vagina, and like that's the way it'll continue ever forward. Like, I want to continue on this riff again, examples from this kind of universe that I was reading and talking about age as it relates to this, where people in this universe as well, because they have complete control over their physicality, I realize this is something I have discussed in the podcast, but I love the topic so much, and there's like 66 of these now that perhaps many people have never heard me discuss it, but that people will actually adjust their age as according to what it is that they want to accomplish. And so, for example, again, what do I mean when I say that? The example would be that if somebody was running a business and they wanted to sort of have a sense of authority and make people, when they look at them or when people looked at them, that they could be trusted, they could exist in a 24-year-old's body, but instead they allow themselves to age without rejuvenating, to get more into their mid-40s, because there's just something about a more aged-looking body that commands authority. I was like, oh, well, that's an interesting concept. And then, like it or not, I am only observing, I'm not even offering my opinions here, but that you would have complete control of your sexuality, whether you were male or female, and there's characters within this universe as well, that because they live for so long, they, talking again about like, what sort of experiences do you want? You get a little bit of column A, you get a little bit of column B. It's your choice. It's a buffet of life, that people would change genders after a period of time. So a person would have been a woman for 100 years, but then they're like, you know what? I think it'd be cool to try out being a man. And so then they try out being a man for another 100 years. There's Ian M. Banks, who actually touches on this as well. I'm talking about Peter F. Hamilton. Ian M. Banks is another like crazy prolific sci-fi author, and he takes this way even further, that, and I think this can be true as well if we don't blow ourselves up, that you would even not stay within the same species. He has people in his universes that they've tried out being a whale for a while, or they've tried out being this other form of consciousness, a whale or a dolphin or a bird or something, but people don't even stay in their lane anymore. They don't even stay in the same species, because you can just adapt or alter or input your consciousness into whatever you would like it to be. So there's a lot there to explore in terms of, I think you start to move more and more towards, as opposed to, and for reasons I completely understand and I'm all on board with now, we think of our life as, we think of the human experience, but I think increasingly what will happen is that we think of the conscious experience, because you will not be so limited to just be the human that you are. We push at the edge of this already in terms of who we are as human beings. Like, we're constantly redefining what that is. I mean, you can see that whether it's in gender, you can see that whether it's in sexuality, and you can see that in the control that we have over these things already. And when it's still, even as it pushes outwards, it's still following the line of, Homo sapiens. Like, we're already pushing out at the edges of it. And I love considering it, because it's interminable. It's something that is going to occur. And for me, where one of the diseases of age that I think is everywhere, is ubiquitous, and I would like to avoid as much as possible, is that narrowing of perspective. And I think that that's basically that it's a bad sign, because it means you can't let go of things. It's that you hear people say, like, things were good and it was great back then, and it's this sort of addiction that we have to nostalgia and a worldview that, because we grew up through it, it feels like ours, but then as we see things continue to evolve, we feel alienated by existence. And so we feel, as opposed to acknowledging that that's simply change, that we say that things were once better than they are now. But really, by any metric, usually, things are way better than they ever were. I always like to drop this book. It's a big one. So it takes a little bit of time to get through, but it's called Enlightenment Now by David Pinker, I think. And it basically talks about how we have this kind of doom and gloom perspective, and that's often because of the media that we consume being so sensationalist to gain control of our attention or to capture our attention. But in actuality, if you go into the hard science, if you go into the analytical approach where you're exploring what is literacy at, what is all-cause mortality at, what is women's rights at, what is the nature of how much war is occurring around the world, education, all of these things that we would define progress by, have all, if you looked at the charts, they're all improving. And so I want to, as I get older, and I think I've done a half-decent job of this by basically following let's say, a non-traditional track, I've been able to feel like I'm participating in. Like, I know most people will say, like, I'm 50 years old, but I don't feel any different than I do when I was 20. But then there's still this sense of alienation that you feel in that time. I'm going to check. What do we got? 28 minutes. Okay, we're still good. We're still good. 28 minutes on the battery. I don't suddenly want to get dropped out. so they say that they feel, at least internally, say physically, they feel the same, but they're still feeling alienated. Where I want to not only, as I do now, I don't feel any different than I did when I was 20. Perhaps a few more scars, whether mental or physical. But I also want that to be true of my experience of life. And I don't have exact answers for that. What are the ways that you can do that? I think, the one that kind of gets thrown out very easily is like, you need to interact with the young. And I was like, yeah, that's a good one. That's a really, really good one. Because then you're staying in touch with at least how are things changing? How do these people view the world? Well, still being acknowledging of the mentor role that you can take to lead people that they don't know what the world is. They're still figuring it out for themselves, but they are having their own ideas, and maybe most importantly, they lack our prejudices. Oh, this makes me want to go on another tangent. I can't, all sorts of privacy reasons, no names or anything. I'll just say I had some students in the last school that I worked at, and one of the favorite things that I love to do with them, this is when I was a licensed teacher, so I had complete control of the class, do whatever I want. And I would like to read things with them and then ask them, what do you think of this? And one of the examples that I gave, and the reason I'm telling this story is to say that they are without prejudice, and you can see how prejudice is trained, is that I talked about one of my favorite authors, got a couple of those, is Ursula K Le Guin, the first woman to win the Hugo Award, which is like one of the highest achievements in science fiction. And I was talking about how she at her time struggled in some sense because that medium of science fiction was considered not ladylike and that women should not write in that. And I said to them, what do you think of that she shouldn't be writing in the field of sci-fi? And everybody in the room, and especially the girls, were like, that's stupid. Well, why wouldn't she do that? No prejudice. That's why they can make that assumption. And it's so funny that a child who is probably, they're not even in their like mid-teens yet, their early teens, is able to see a clearer view of the world than adults who had defined that box that Ursula was supposed to be in, who were supposed to be mature and educated and well-knowing of, the social way that we should go about our lives. But clearly, a 13-year-old is more intelligent than all of those people. And so the point being that the youth is full of wisdom because of this lack of prejudice that they have. And so interacting with the young can be really, really good. It's important because you're like, oh, I'd forgotten how plainly true some of these things in existence are, because I'd been imprinted by the elder society and their prejudices and their hang-ups to make me think that that's how things should be, when they don't. They don't have to be that way at all. We can define existence however we want. That's how we progress socially. That's how we're able to look in this day and age back on the 50s and before and being like, man, these people, like, how could they live like that? And just as assuredly, we will make the mistake now to think that we are lofty, evolved, and educated and far-seeing in our social norms, when if we don't blow ourselves up, that in 50, 60, 70 years from now, closer than that really, people will be looking back just like rubbing, full facepalm, like, God, they were absolute just cavemen, cave women at that time. How could they be so inhumane to each other? And that's why I really do embrace. I'm not saying I don't wholeheartedly agree with it, because I think that there's another a weakness of the youth per se is, I think, also overshooting things. I mean, I still do this. I'm overly passionate. I'm not able to look at things. And so the youth often overshoots, where they're like, no, then we should do this. And you're like, no, don't do that. That's just stupid. That's stupid. So they overshoot, but it's somewhere in the middle that they're progressing forward with new ideas, forms of acceptance, inclusion, that could be considered as incredibly valuable. So lots to consider there. But the one that I wanted to talk about, where that's the first one that usually gets thrown out, is to say that, oh, well, you could involve yourself with a younger generation to see what it is they feel, to see what wisdom they have without the prejudices that I do ingrained in me. But I also think foundationally, fundamentally, that you can keep this kind of not being embittered with life if you continue to learn things And if you continue, you don't need a younger generation to have new experiences, to be willing to have new experiences. We really get into a groove. I mean, that means like not just groovy, but like quite, you think of the word as it like cuts into a table or something, this track that we go down so many times that it's hard for us to get out of it. It's true. It's true in a fundamental, like a neuroplastic way, how we form habits, and then because we form that pathway, that we are more likely to go down it. There was some excellent example in a book that I was reading about the brain that talks about, this is a great analogy for it, is where if you went up to the top of a mountain and you were looking down, it's all powder and there's no tracks, and so you choose a course. But then when you get to the top of the mountain again, the likelihood that you'll choose that course if it worked out well is very, very high, because it's familiar to you now, and there was so much risk navigating it the first time. But if you are able to resist that familiar track that you had progressed down the mountain the first time and take an alternative course, it will armor you. It will make you resilient to bitterness. It will make you anti-fragile, which is the awesome Bible of a book that I'm reading right now to help me through more recent times in my life. So I think that's fundamental. It's got to be having new experiences, teaching yourself new things. What we know about neuroplasticity very clearly shows that you can teach an old dog new tricks. That epitaph, not that. That slogan, let's just call it that, is completely false. There's no reason that as you get older that you wouldn't be able to experience new things and gain from it the same sort of neuroplastic benefits that you would when you were younger by having a whole bunch of different experiences. When you do it, your brain functions differently. There is, in younger people, there's a greater optionality. There is the greater ability to be more neuroplastic, and there is less so when you're older, but you can still totally do it. You just need to be more purposeful. You need to do it by will as opposed to by grace when you were younger. And I think that that's awesome. So having those experiences, yes, very, very, very cool. Resisting falling into a groove, I think that I keep saying armored. I'm trying to think of more cool words for grants you fortitude in the realm of bitterness. I don't know. I don't know how exactly I should say this. Doesn't matter really. I've been thinking a lot about, just the other day, these cool concepts that were coming out of thinking about ways. Say you're an entrepreneur. I'm going to go on a completely new track now, discuss something different. Thinking about being an entrepreneur and thinking about resiliency, anti-fragility, and he was talking about how one of the best ways that you can look for this in your life is by exercising the power of options. I was like, well, what does that mean? I was like, what's an option is defined by anti-fragility, the way that this is being discussed. And so an option is basically something that gives you gain with only an upside and very little, if not zero downside. And I was like, okay, that makes sense. That's like, okay, that's really, really practical. When we think about options in our day-to-day, perhaps it's not exactly like this, because you might think of, we hear that term for like cars, and options have a major downside, because if you're going to get those options on your car, they cost thousands and thousands of dollars. But this is talking about options more in the context, when it's a business context, of, say, for example, that if you were to have the option to go out and do something yourself, which has zero investment other than your time, or if you could rent a piece of equipment. So when you rent that the option to rent that piece of equipment could have a huge upside to you, but there's no downside to you not doing that. Another example of an option would be somebody tells you, without pressing on you, that there's a party happening and you're invited. And so this means that your life could either be equal to it as it is now, or you could enrich it with a great social experience by going out and enjoying the option of being invited to a party. And so if you're going to have really good business ideas, to try and design them around this optionality, that if you go down this way, it's just going to enrich you, but by not participating in this, you don't experience a downside. And so I'm trying to think about different ways to do this. I think one of the classic ways to do this, if you thought about it in terms of business, is things that do this a lot are things that create, I heard I think it's Matty Opche or whatever, he's quite successful on YouTube. He was talking about money trees, which is another way to say passive income. So you build things that they simply return to you, and another word you could use is overhead. They have absolutely zero overhead. So considering things around you like this that you would be able to do. Now, I don't have all the answers there. I don't know all the different things that are great options to take, but I think when you put things in this context, then you're like, oh, that is a good way to do it. Whereas non-optionality, things that are fragile, are things that leverage you, that could give you an incredible gain, but then conversely could give you an insane downside. Now, this isn't advocating for not taking risks, but it does make you aware of just how much a risk could cost you if you're not established, if you're just trying to get into something. Because if you take a risk that then if it fails prevents you from taking any more risks, that's an incredibly fragile idea because, well, you can risk it all on this. You might say the expression like putting all your eggs in one basket, but if it fails, well, then you're totally done. I'm not removing the idea that you might want to use that at some point in your business. I mean, I think you have the example of like Tesla and their SpaceX program, that where when it came down to having these like self-landing rockets, they had to take one of these fragile risks where it was either that this rocket succeeded or that they couldn't go ahead at all. But it doesn't all have to be that way. There's like, you can reinforce yourself. There was like, I'm thinking of the expression of like digging in. That's how you do it. There's like reinforcement, defense. Yeah, we'll get there. There's words to get, I just, you're like, it's right on the tip of my tongue, the perfect thing that would describe this. But my chair is sinking again. Okay, I'm always losing inches of height over the course of this podcast. I have to get a new chair. That's going to happen soon. Really, really cool concepts there in the book, specifically for people who are interested in business. Oh, here's another great concept, and I was like, this is near and dear to my heart. What's our time? What do we got? Oh, 16 minutes. We're killing it. We're crushing it. Okay. It was in terms of cultivating a really good audience at whatever it is that you're doing that, how can I put this? This is going to be a little bit of a like in my head. Oh, okay. So it was basically the upside to creating things where even if you have haters, it doesn't matter. So it was basically, if you have people, I could use the example of if you were an author. If people are, when you create a book, all that you have in that situation, it's a great option once the book is created, because there is only an upside to people buying your book. You are not hurt by somebody saying, I'm not going to buy your book. You're just at where you were before. I was like, oh, that's a really, really good idea. And then that also we said, even if you have in this context people who do not support what you're doing, that some of the most successful authors are those who had the greatest haters. Like, for example, if you want to make a book massively popular, ban it. So it actually, in this way, you've created an optionality for yourself where even through positive reinforcement of the people who enjoy whatever it is that you're doing, when they purchase things, that's helping you. And then when people hate you enough to talk about you, well, that's helping you because now they're creating some kind of buzz around whatever it is that you're doing. That I loved exploring this idea. He was like, something that is really, really important to grasp is the idea as envy. And I was like, okay, well, I've thought about envy before. Like, let's go into this a little bit deeper. And he's like, envy is a form of love, and in fact, potentially more powerful. People are so enamored with what you do, and they're so impressed by it that it has made them hate you. I was like, oh, that's powerful, isn't it? So that you would, if you are truly successful, you must necessarily incite envy in some portion of the population, because that means that you are that powerful, that you have created something that is so impactful that people don't even have the option to ignore it. They have to participate in it, and they have to either love it or hate it. And both of these, in the context of an author, are something that are going to propel you on to further success. I'm getting a phone call right now. I can't answer this right now. We have to do the podcast. Damn this life. Anyways, so it was really, really good. Basically, what it was going into was that also in this way that it mattered to me in the sort of thing that I'm trying to do in my main channel and trying to do in the podcast as well, is that people who have made themselves beholden to someone for stability stifle the potential of this kind of optionality, because when you are beholden to someone, you need to censor and curate whatever it is that you create to that authority over you, which doesn't allow you to usually have the sort of impact that creates these more interested people in whatever it is. Call them fans, call them supporters, call them patrons in what you're doing. I use the word dilute, but yeah, essentially makes your shit not matter, because you had to make it digestible and so mass appealing that it robs you of an identity. And I was like, oh yes, tell me what I want to hear. So I'm always testing these theories out. I mean, so far as it is, like on my main channel, it's funny where I've like really gone down this route. I've actually seen just recently, I was like, yes, another decrease in subscribers. Interesting. And I continually double down on this. I'm like, it's too artsy, make it artsier. Less people are watching, have even less people watch it. Just like keep going down that path. But then, in a way that I could confirm, in a way that I want to believe and I would also objectively like to think is true, in this time that I've done that, I've seen my subscribers go down, but also where I'd seen no growth on Patreon, I've now seen more people. It's not a huge amount, it's 3, but 3 compared to 0, 300% improvement. That's what matters. And so wouldn't it be funny if actually my channel started to get smaller and smaller and smaller, while I increasingly gained stability in the way that matters? That would be a fantastic outcome, wouldn't it? Wow. Well, this was, can you tell I had a coffee? Fantastic. Thank you for coming with me on this crazy ride through all these different topics that we've been on here. I really appreciate you. Say it again, appreciate the patrons. If you don't support me there, please do consider doing so. If you want more content like this, you know what to do. It's the S button. I'm like, however I can express that without actually saying that algorithmic necessity that I hate so much. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. I would have put my contact details down below, so if you want to get a hold of me, you can. Lots of content coming out. Of course, 2 times a week we're doing the podcast, as well as shorts across Instagram, TikTok, YouTube Shorts, more content on the main channel, these great things. I hope that you're having a good week. I hope that you're enjoying fall and that the people that you care about are safe, healthy, and happy, and that the world sooner than later finds greater peace than the situation it finds itself in now. That's all. Catch you in the next one.